started as a courtroom drama and escalated into something much more, something almost cinematic. Within a span of just 7 minutes, a federal courtroom went from hushed legal proceedings to an explosive confrontation between authority, speech, and consequence. The key players? A controversial judge, a scathing insult directed at the President of the United States, and a swift arrest by a no-nonsense officer. Judge Ronald Leavitt, known for his brash courtroom style and unfiltered commentary, stepped over a line many in the room didn't even see coming. During what should have been a routine sentencing hearing, Leavitt paused mid-ruling, turned to the gallery, and unleashed a blistering remark about President Joe Biden. The exact quote? Officials have yet to release it in full, citing decorum, but several eyewitnesses confirmed that it was deeply personal and profanely disrespectful. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. It wasn't just the shock of a federal judge publicly attacking the sitting president, it was the speed with which justice circled back on one of its own. Just 7 minutes later, Officer Pamela Bondi, who had been stationed near the judge's bench, received an urgent directive. She stepped forward firm and deliberate and read Leavitt his rights. No yelling, no protest, just the clinking sound of cold cuffs as they locked onto the wrists of a man who had spent his life ordering others into chains. Spectators were stunned. Some reached for their phones, others stood frozen in disbelief. One court reporter whispered, "I've never seen anything like this, and I've covered trials for 20 years. The Department of Justice later confirmed that Leavitt had been fined $100,000 for violating the Judicial Code of Conduct and potentially inciting public distrust in federal institutions. The fine alone made headlines, but it was the arrest that made history. It's virtually unheard of for a sitting federal judge to be publicly detained in the very space they once presided over. Legal scholars scrambled to interpret the sequence of events. Was Leavitt's statement protected under the First Amendment? Or had he crossed the blurry line between free speech and dereliction of judicial duty? The bench isn't a soapbox, said constitutional law expert Dr. Renee Calloway. Judges swear an oath to impartiality. What we witnessed today wasn't just misconduct. It was a flagrant betrayal of the judicial role. Still, some are defending Leavitt, claiming that his comment, while inappropriate, doesn't warrant criminal detention. We're sliding into dangerous territory when judges can't express concerns, however harsh, about elected officials, said one anonymous source close to Leavitt. But for many watching, the moment represented something far bigger than one. Judges fall from grace. It was a reminder of the high standards entrusted to those in power and the consequences when they're ignored. Leavitt is now facing formal disciplinary proceedings, and insiders suggest this may not be the last. We hear of him. Rumors are already swirling about possible impeachment from the bench, legal challenges to the arrest, and even claims of political retaliation. For now, though, he sits in a holding cell awaiting formal arraignment. A man once cloaked in the robes of justice now facing the gavel from the other side, and all because of one moment of unchecked arrogance, one insult too far. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had already begun to gather. News vans lined the street. Protesters waved signs, some supporting Leavitt's right to free speech, others demanding he be stripped of his robe permanently. The courthouse, usually a place of quiet proceedings and structured arguments, had become the epicenter of a political and judicial earthquake. Back inside, federal officials were scrambling to get ahead of the fallout. The U.S. Marshals Service confirmed Leavitt had been taken to a secure facility, citing concerns over both his high-profile status and the volatility of public reaction. A press conference was announced, but delayed twice, reportedly due to disagreements within the Justice Department over how to frame the incident. By evening, social media was ablaze. Clips of the moment Bondi placed Leavitt in handcuffs were shared millions of times. Hashtags like Chishkir Judgment Day and Leavitt Unrobed trended worldwide. Pundits from both sides of the political spectrum weighed in. Some painted Leavitt as a martyr, for free speech, a man punished for saying what others were thinking. Others argued his downfall was overdue, a consequence of years of unchecked judicial power finally catching up to him. President Biden's administration remained notably silent. When pressed for a statement during a scheduled press event, White House Press Secretary Mara Evans responded cautiously. We have full faith in the Department of Justice to handle internal matters with integrity and impartiality. The President will not comment on ongoing disciplinary or criminal investigations. But silence in this case only fueled speculation. Was Leavitt's insult something so severe, so inflammatory, that it threatened national security? Or was the administration seeking to avoid giving it any further oxygen? Back in legal circles, an even more pressing question emerged. What precedent does this set? The arrest of a sitting judge for words spoken in court could mark a historic shift in how judicial accountability is enforced. Until now, disciplinary actions for misconduct, especially verbal misconduct, were handled quietly through judicial review boards. Public arrests were almost unheard of. But as one federal appellate clerk put it, what happened today sent a loud message. Not even the bench is above the law. Leavitt's legal team has already filed a motion to dismiss all charges, claiming the arrest was unconstitutional, politically motivated, and in violation of judicial immunity. The motion is expected to trigger a high-profile legal battle that could redefine the limits of judicial speech and accountability for years to come. As night fell, the courthouse lights stayed on. Bondi, stoic and unflinching, returned to her post. Reporters buzzed with anticipation of the next move. And somewhere in a stark white holding cell, Judge Ronald Leavitt sat alone, stripped of his robe, his courtroom, and perhaps in time, his legacy. It all happened in 7 minutes. A sentence, an insult, a set of handcuffs, and a career possibly shattered forever. The morning after Leavitt's arrest, America awoke to a legal system in crisis. Every major news outlet led with the same image. A once feared federal judge, head bowed, being led down the marble steps of his own courthouse in cuffs. Editorials flooded in. Some called it the darkest day in modern judicial history. Others hailed it as a long overdue reckoning. But while the media frenzy intensified, a quieter battle was unfolding behind closed doors. One that could have consequences reaching all the way to the Supreme Court. Leavitt's legal team, led by high-powered attorney Marcia Devane, filed an emergency injunction with the Court of Appeals. In her filing, Devane didn't just argue for Leavitt's release. She claimed the judge's arrest represented a blatant violation of separation of powers, and warned that, if upheld, it would open the floodgates for political manipulation of the judiciary. This wasn't a rogue comment, Devane told reporters. It was protected speech made in the context of a courtroom, a space historically afforded the greatest latitude for expression, especially by judges. If we start arresting judges for opinions, even inflammatory ones, then no ruling is safe from reprisal. But the DOJ hit back hard. In a late-night statement, Deputy Attorney General Lionel Cray said Leavitt's conduct was not mere speech, but a dangerous act of sedition masquerading as opinion. Cray claimed Leavitt had access to sealed information and used his platform to imply threats and sow instability in public trust. He hinted at deeper, undisclosed connections that could come to light in the days ahead. That was enough to spark a wave of speculation. Did Leavitt know something he wasn't supposed to say? Was his attack on Biden spontaneous or part of something bigger? Already, conspiracy theorists seized the moment, claiming Leavitt was a whistleblower being silenced. Fringe platforms circulated doctored audio tapes and grainy photos alleging secret meetings and coded messages hidden in previous rulings. Most of it was baseless noise, but it was noise loud enough to muddy the truth. Meanwhile, inside the federal detention center, Leavitt reportedly refused meals, demanded a typewriter instead of a laptop, and began drafting a public statement of conscience. Multiple sources close to the jail said Leavitt intended to release a manifesto of sorts, explaining the full motivation behind his courtroom outburst. If that statement emerges, it could be explosive. If it doesn't, the silence may prove more deafening. At the same time, internal investigations into Leavitt's past rulings have begun. Analysts are now combing through transcripts, looking for patterns of bias, coded language, or political signaling. One controversial case, U.S. vs. Harmon, in which Leavitt threw out a gun trafficking charge citing overreach by liberal lawmakers, has resurfaced with renewed scrutiny. And then there's Officer Pamela Bondi. Though she acted swiftly and by the book, Bondi has now been pulled into the national spotlight. Critics are questioning whether her arrest of Leavitt was truly her call, or whether she was operating on a direct order from higher up. Sources close to the courthouse suggest she received a discreet communication on her secure device just minutes after Leavitt's outburst. Who sent it, and on whose authority, remains unknown. One thing is certain, this story is far from over. What began as a judge lashing out in a moment of fury has spiraled into a full-scale constitutional storm. The battle lines are drawn between those defending the sanctity of judicial independence and those demanding accountability for even the most powerful voices on the bench. In the coming days, the world will watch as Judge Ronald Leavitt's case unfolds, not just in the courtroom but in the court of public opinion, and perhaps in history itself. 3 days after his arrest, the document surfaced. Typed in bold courier font on thick cream-colored paper, Judge Ronald Leavitt's self-described statement of conscience was leaked to the press late Sunday night. It wasn't sent through legal channels. It wasn't delivered by his attorney. Instead, it appeared in a brown envelope slid under the newsroom door of the National Ledger, the only outlet Leavitt had ever granted a personal interview during his 2-decade tenure. Sapiwer manifesto was 9 pages long. The tone? Defiant, introspective, and seething. "I do not apologize," it began. "I do not retract. And I do not fear the consequence of speaking aloud what others whisper behind closed doors. This country's leadership is compromised by mediocrity, by cowardice, by the slow, corrosive erosion of constitutional clarity." Leavitt didn't name President Biden directly until page 3, but when he did, he referred to him as a figurehead propped up by handlers, speaking in platitudes while the machinery of government is steered by unelected shadows. He accused the current administration of weaponizing civility to suppress criticism and cocooning themselves in institutional armor to avoid scrutiny. But the most shocking lines came midway through the document. "I was briefed, informally, yes, but sufficiently. What I know about this administration's quiet overreach into judiciary autonomy would shake the public if declassified. I said what I said in court because no one else would." Leavitt offered no evidence, no dates, no sources. Yet the implication was explosive, that he had knowledge of confidential political maneuvers, perhaps illegal, intended to influence the judiciary. Within hours, talking heads erupted. Was he bluffing, delusional, or trying to provoke an investigation from behind bars? His defense team remained tight-lipped, refusing to confirm whether the manifesto was authorized or authentic. But 2 federal agents anonymously confirmed to the Ledger that the physical document had been verified as coming from Leavitt's cell. The Department of Justice fired back by the end of the day. "Judge Leavitt is no whistleblower," said Deputy AG Lionel Cray in an emergency press briefing. "He is a man under investigation, now lashing out to cloud the truth. There are no programs targeting judicial autonomy. His allegations are not only false, they are reckless." But the damage had been done. Public opinion was fracturing. Protests erupted outside federal courthouses in D.C., Chicago, and Denver. Some demanded transparency and an independent review of Leavitt's claims. Others, holding signs that read "Jail the Judge," accused him of attempting to destabilize the government. Inside Washington, a quiet panic took hold. Congressional leaders called for closed-door briefings. Intelligence committees began reviewing internal communications between judges and federal agencies. What had once seemed like a clean-cut disciplinary case was now threatening to ignite a broader constitutional reckoning. Meanwhile, Leavitt was moved to a high-security isolation unit, allegedly for his own protection. According to prison staff, he continues to write. More pages, more statements, possibly more accusations. A second document is rumored to be in circulation, containing names of officials he claims enabled the erosion of judicial independence. One thing is certain. Judge Leavitt has broken more than courtroom decorum. He's broken open a crisis. Whether he's telling the truth or crafting a martyrdom fantasy, The government is now forced to respond. The rulebook is gone. The gavel lies silent. And across the country, people are asking the question no one thought they'd hear in a modern democracy. What happens when the judge becomes the accused and refuses to back down? By midweek, Washington was no longer simply reacting, it was on high alert. The Attorney General ordered a federal task force to review Judge Leavitt's last 5 years of rulings, correspondence, and internal memos. Congressional committees scheduled emergency closed-door sessions. National security advisors were summoned to brief the president, and for the first time since the manifesto's release, whispers of a special counsel began to circulate, not to investigate Leavitt, but to examine the accusations he leveled. The shift was subtle at first. A single senator, then 3, then an entire bipartisan coalition of lawmakers began calling for transparency. Not all of them believed Leavitt, but they couldn't ignore him anymore. His words had taken on a life of their own. He may be a broken voice, Senator Reyes, DMA, told reporters, but that doesn't mean he's not pointing at something real. If there's even a shred of credibility to what he's alleging, it demands our attention. On the other side of the aisle, Senator Calvin Marks, RTX, a longtime critic of Biden's administration, took it further. This is no longer about decorum. This is about a man who sat behind the bench for decades saying the entire system is compromised. That's not a scandal. It's a seismic event. But not everyone was convinced. Former colleagues of Leavitt began speaking out, painting a picture of a man growing increasingly erratic in the months leading up to the outburst. One anonymous clerk described late-night emails filled with cryptic, paranoid warnings. Another revealed that Leavitt had recently begun locking himself in chambers for hours, requesting no contact, even during trial recesses. He started muttering about surveillance, internal betrayal, even blackmail, one colleague said. We thought he was just cracking under pressure. Now, we're not sure. Amid the swirl of speculation, the White House finally broke its silence. President Biden, in a brief address from the Rose Garden, struck a careful tone. "Let me be clear," he said. "No administration, including mine, should ever interfere with the independence of the judiciary, and I welcome any lawful review of our procedures and communications to affirm that principle." The statement calmed some nerves, but it wasn't enough for others. Leavitt's supporters claimed it was too polished, too rehearsed, and most notably, too delayed. To them, Biden's words confirmed what they feared, that the administration had something to hide. Meanwhile, Pamela Bondi, the officer who made the initial arrest, was called to testify in a private committee session. Sources confirmed that during questioning, she revealed she received a directive via secure DOJ channel labeled Class 3 Priority, Judicial Containment. The wording alone was enough to cause panic. What is judicial containment? Who issued the order? And why was it used on a sitting judge? Theories bloomed like wildfire. Some claimed Leavitt had uncovered a surveillance program targeting specific judges based on ideology. Others believed he was baited into the outburst, his arrest part of a broader operation to root out dissent within the judicial branch. The DOJ has denied all of it. But the mere existence of that term, judicial containment, is now under internal audit, and still, Leavitt writes. A second document, leaked 2 days after the first, listed a string of names: senior officials, corporate donors, even former judicial peers. Each was marked with a cryptic annotation: protected, compromised, neutral. No explanations, no evidence, just names. The impact? Immediate. 3 resignations followed within 24 hours. A federal judge in Nevada, a legal advisor at the DOJ, and a senior aide to the Senate Judiciary Committee, all offering no comment. Whether coincidence or consequence, it further cracked the facade of government control. In the halls of power, anxiety deepened. And across the nation, people began to ask a chilling new question. If Leavitt is wrong, why does everyone seem so afraid of what he might say next? By the following week, Washington was no longer just bracing, it was unraveling. The leaked name list from Leavitt's second manifesto, 37 individuals spanning the judiciary, executive agencies, and legal lobby groups hit like a thunderclap. Cable news anchors struggled to keep up as the resignations ticked upward. Whispers of sealed indictments, hidden conflicts of interest, and previously dismissed ethics complaints now gained sudden relevance. One name, however, stood out. Justice Miriam Coyle of the U.S. Court of Appeals, long considered a quiet centrist and rumored Supreme Court nominee, was listed with a single word: compromised. Within 12 hours of the leak, she withdrew from consideration for the nation's highest court and announced an indefinite leave of absence. Her spokesperson offered no explanation. The silence was louder than words. Amid the chaos, Attorney General Hugo Reynolds made a rare appearance before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Behind closed doors, he answered questions for nearly 6 hours. When he emerged, his statement was brief but historic. The Department of Justice has authorized the appointment of a special counsel to independently investigate the circumstances surrounding Judge Ronald Leavitt's arrest, his allegations, and any potential breaches of judicial autonomy. This is not a political concession. It is a necessary safeguard. Within hours, retired prosecutor and former U.S. Solicitor General Nathan Varga was named special counsel. Known for his fearlessness and nonpartisan history, having investigated administrations on both sides of the aisle, Varga issued a cryptic but firm declaration. Let the record be unsealed. Let the truth be unburied. I will follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if that means to the highest bench or the deepest basement. That same night, protests erupted in over 24 cities. What began as isolated demonstrations had transformed into something organized, vocal, and growing. The movement took a name: Benchfire. Protesters demanded full transparency, publication of all documents Leavitt referenced, and public hearings on possible judicial surveillance. The #Benchfire trended globally. Marches were held outside courthouses, Senate offices, and DOJ buildings. Some were peaceful, others less so. In Atlanta, a federal courthouse was evacuated after demonstrators surrounded the building and refused to disperse. In Minneapolis, a group of protesters unfurled a massive banner across the freeway: "Unrobe the truth." In New York, a rogue contingent stormed the Federal Circuit Archive office, live streaming themselves searching for sealed dockets before being detained. The country was no longer debating whether something was wrong. It was demanding to know just how deep it went. Meanwhile, inside his isolated detention suite, Judge Leavitt remained silent. His attorney, Marcia Devane, released a single sentence to the press: "He will speak again when the nation is ready to hear, not just listen." But as the special counsel's team began its initial inquiries, a disturbing discovery was leaked by an internal DOJ whistleblower: an encrypted folder marked Spectre Ledger, hidden on a secure DOJ server. Within it, documents reportedly detail years of informal communications between high-level judicial clerks and political appointees, some of which date back to before Biden's term. If authenticated, this could support Leavitt's central claim that judicial independence was being quietly eroded under the guise of interdepartmental coordination. The term Spectre Protocol appears multiple times, its exact meaning still unknown. Varga's team is moving quickly. Subpoenas are being issued. Witnesses are being relocated. A classified annex to the investigation has already been established, suggesting matters of national security are now entangled in the unfolding scandal. And through it all, one looming question has begun to dominate both headlines and hushed. Private conversations in every wing of government. Was Leavitt insane? Or was he the first to scream in a system gone silent for too long? The Spectre Ledger changed everything. On a cold Monday morning, just 9 days after Judge Leavitt's arrest, the encrypted folder was decrypted by an anonymous cyber forensics team and shared with The Beacon, a respected centrist investigative outlet known for its refusal to play partisan games. What they found confirmed the darkest suspicions. The documents, over 600 pages worth, detailed a covert interagency framework that had been active since at least 2016, though its roots likely stretched back further. Under the innocuous title, Interdepartmental Judicial Oversight Memo Number 0427S. The Spectre Protocol outlined the creation of an informal task force composed of DOJ legal advisors, select NSA liaisons, and high-level staffers from the Office of the White House Counsel. Its purpose? Strategic flagging and influence-guided shaping of judges who were deemed systemically unpredictable or ideologically problematic. The documents stopped short of explicit orders to alter rulings, but what they did show was no less chilling. Secret psychological profiles of federal judges, surveillance of their online habits, even flagged transcripts of off-the-record courtroom remarks. Most damning was the list of names, judges, clerks, and reporters, categorized under internal designations like signal-checked, bureau-aligned, and high-risk drift. And yes, Ronald Leavitt's name appeared. His file was updated 6 months prior to his arrest, marked high-risk drift, potential trigger. The final notation read, monitoring recommended. Escalation protocol. Bondi Alpha 3, if activation threshold is met. It didn't take long for the dots to connect. The so-called Bondi protocol, the exact chain of command that had Pamela Bondi arrest Leavitt just 7 minutes after his courtroom remarks, was no longer theoretical. It was real, planned, prepped. Pamela Bondi, now a lightning rod for national attention, was subpoenaed by special counsel Nathan Varga within the hour of the leak. She remained composed, but her pre-hearing statement betrayed the weight of what she now carried. I followed orders. I acted within the chain of command, but I did not know what I was enforcing. Behind the scenes, the DOJ scrambled. The Attorney General, previously resolute, now faced internal revolt. Several assistant AGs threatened resignation unless a full disclosure of the Spectre documents was made public. White House Press Secretary Mara Evans canceled her daily briefing, and whispers emerged from within the NSA itself of internal purges, sudden transfers, and at least 2 suicides among named operatives. The benchfire protests surged in response. By nightfall, thousands had gathered outside federal courthouses in over 40 cities. This was no longer just about Leavitt. It had become a reckoning, a boiling over of long-held fears about the quiet machinery humming beneath American democracy. Protesters held up the leaked documents in printed form, reading excerpts aloud through bullhorns. One quote from a Spectre memo was repeated again and again, becoming a chilling refrain. Influence is best applied where it is never detected. Nathan. Varga addressed the nation that evening in a rare televised special counsel update. His tone was sober. His message, shattering. Let us be absolutely clear. What we have uncovered is not an isolated policy gone astray. It is a systematic breach of the very separation of powers our Constitution was built to preserve. The judiciary has been shadowed, monitored, and nudged, not by foreign enemies but by our own institutions. This investigation will not stop. It cannot stop. Not until every actor is identified and every mechanism dismantled. As he spoke, a storm of resignation swept through Washington. 3 federal judges stepped down. A senior NSA operations director was placed on immediate leave. And in a midnight move, the deputy chief of staff to the president submitted his resignation. No explanation given. And yet, amidst the chaos, Leavitt remained silent. For once, he did not release a third manifesto. No notes, no warnings. Just one line spoken to his attorney and later confirmed by Varga's office. I said what needed to be said. Now they know I wasn't lying. In the end, it wasn't just the judge who had been unrobed. It was the system. And America, wide-eyed and uncertain, now stared into the depths of its own reflection, asking the most terrifying question of all: if the judiciary isn't independent, then who exactly is judging whom? It happened without ceremony. At 3:42 a.m., under armed escort and without prior announcement, Judge Ronald Leavitt was released from federal custody. No press, no cameras, no courtroom. Just a curt memo signed by special counsel Nathan Varga. In light of recently verified documents and the scope of systemic misconduct uncovered, The continued detention of Judge Ronald Leavitt is unwarranted. Charges are suspended indefinitely pending review. Leavitt didn't speak as he stepped out into the cold morning air. His lawyer, Marcia Devane, shielded him from reporters who had assembled after a DOJ staffer leaked his release. Leavitt wore no robe, no shackles, just a plain black suit and the look of a man who had spent too long telling the truth to walls that wouldn't listen. Until now. But his freedom was not the only shock that morning. Just hours later, the president convened an emergency session of Congress in the Capitol's underground continuity chamber, reserved only for times of extreme national threat. Both chambers, intelligence chiefs, and judiciary leadership were summoned. Phones were locked in biometric vaults. Live streams were cut. What was said in that 3-hour session remains classified, but what followed was unmistakable. The government began a controlled unraveling of its own design. By noon, the White House released a public statement acknowledging multi-administration, policy failures in preserving judicial integrity. President Biden, appearing visibly shaken, made the announcement himself. This was not a single administration's misstep. It was decades of quiet encroachment, institutional laziness, and failure to defend the one thing this country has always promised: unbiased justice. That ends now. He announced the immediate formation of an independent commission for judicial sovereignty co-chaired by retired Supreme Court Justice Elena Ross and, shockingly, Leavitt himself. The reaction was swift and divided. Some hailed it as historic transparency, others as damage control draped in constitutional theater. But beyond America's borders, allies and adversaries alike saw a window into the soul of the United States, and many didn't like what they saw. In London, Parliament suspended 2 bilateral judicial accords pending clarification of U.S. legal norms. In Brussels, the EU called for a joint review of all extradition agreements with the United States, citing concerns about political interference in judiciary outcomes. China's state media seized the moment, running endless cycles of American hypocrisy clips, while Russia formally condemned what it called the staged collapse of a rotting liberal experiment. Markets trembled. Legal analysts around the world questioned the validity of recent U.S. rulings in international trade courts. Immigration judges in Canada paused deportation orders involving the U.S., citing systemic uncertainty. Domestically, things were no calmer. In Washington, protest camps became semi-permanent, filled with legal scholars, student coalitions, and retired judges demanding structural reforms. The Supreme Court postponed hearings. Law schools saw mass walkouts. Several states introduced bills requiring full transparency of communications between state judges and federal agencies, and yet, amid the frenzy, Leavitt re-emerged. At a late-night press conference standing before a wall of shattered trust, he finally spoke, not with rage, but with gravity. I did not set out to expose a conspiracy. I set out to defend a principle. But what I found was that the conspiracy was already there, woven into the walls of our institutions, hidden behind decades of polite complicity. This is not my vindication. This is our warning. He paused, staring into the lens, his voice suddenly soft. A government that watches its judges in secret is not preserving justice, it is preparing to bury it. His words were clipped across media platforms, dissected in courtrooms and classrooms alike. But they had already settled in the public conscience. No longer was Judge Ronald Leavitt the rogue jurist. He had become something else. A symbol. A mirror. A reckoning. And now, as the nation faced its own uncomfortable reflection, a final question echoed through every chamber of power, every law school hall, every courtroom bench. 6 months later, the hearings were held in the open, broadcast live with no redactions, no closed sessions, and no anonymous sources. The Commission for Judicial Sovereignty became the most watched government event since Watergate. Millions tuned in daily, not out of spectacle, but out of a grim, necessary hunger to understand how it happened. How did Spectre begin? The answer came from the last person anyone expected to speak. Elliot Grange, former deputy White House counsel under the Reagan Clinton and Bush administrations, an institutional relic with clearance levels buried deeper than any civilian, name on record, walked into the hearing room uninvited. He had not been subpoenaed. He had not been contacted. He simply walked in, demanded to speak, and sat before the commission without a lawyer. He explained it all. Spectre, he revealed, began not as surveillance, but as insurance. The idea was born after the narrow and bitterly divided Supreme Court decision in Bush v. Gore, 2000. The chaos that followed terrified both parties. Grange said the fear wasn't just that courts could sway elections, it was that a single independent judge, rogue or idealistic, could undo entire legislative agendas or emergency orders in times of crisis. So Spectre was designed. At first, it was little more than a classified watch list, judges tracked for their unpredictability or personal politics. But it metastasized with each administration. Democrat, Republican, wartime, peacetime. One by one, new agencies signed on. New protocols were added. First, data tracking, then personality profiling, then direct lines of influence. All for the sake of national stability. What began as caution had evolved into quiet tyranny. Grange ended with a plea not of innocence, but accountability. We were not evil men. We were frightened men. But fear is no excuse to build a machine that can tilt the law in the dark. The Commission's final report, dubbed the Leavitt Ledger, was released nationwide on November 5, 2025. It named 83 officials across 6 administrations, 4 Supreme Court justices, 16 federal judges, over 100 DOJ staffers, a dozen senior NSA and CIA officials. Most had already resigned. Others were indicted. A few fled the country before warrants were issued. 2, tragically, took their own lives. Congress passed the Judicial Transparency and Sovereignty Act in a rare unanimous vote. The law outlawed interagency data sharing on members of the judiciary, created an independent watchdog group with real prosecutorial power, and required all future judicial appointments and interactions to be logged publicly in a tamper-proof database. And as for Leavitt, he declined the book deals, the interviews, the speaking tours. He refused to run for office. He returned to the house he'd lived in for 20 years, now guarded by local volunteers and students who saw him not just as a whistleblower, but as a turning point in American democracy. In his final public address, delivered at the swearing-in of the first post-Spectre federal judge panel, Leavitt spoke plainly. We learned that silence can be strategic, that secrecy in the hands of the powerful becomes a weapon. But we also learned something else, that truth, when spoken without fear, echoes louder than surveillance, louder than protocols, louder than the machine. He stepped down from the dais. No applause. No music. Just the sound of chairs scraping back as every single person in that hall rose to their feet, not in celebration, but in solemn recognition of a man who stood when others bent, of a system brought to its knees so it could rise again, and of a nation reminded at last what justice is supposed to feel like.